I personally started paying attention to internal trade between Canadian provinces in early 2007 when the Trade, Investment and Labour Mobility Agreement, TILMA, was about to come into effect between Alberta and British Columbia. And this was a deal that was supposed to get rid of these interprovincial trade barriers. Since then, the existing agreement on internal trade between the provinces has been strengthened and amended a great deal. There's also been an Ontario-Quebec economic partnership agreement. There's been a partnership agreement on regulation in the economy signed by New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And most recently, just about a week ago, the new Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa came out with this paper with a brand new proposal, again summarized in today's Globe and Mail, saying that the federal government should enact a charter of economic rights for Canadians and should establish a new Economic Freedom Commission to enforce that charter and strike down these interprovincial trade barriers. So there's been a real flurry of activity on this front in the past few years, and I'm going to try to give you a bit of an explanation of what it's all about. What are these interprovincial trade barriers that are being talked about? Is that the real issue, or are there other things that are at play in the internal trade agenda? And really, what are the implications of some of these deals like TILMA and some of these more recent proposals to have an Economic Freedom Commission? So I think this phrase interprovincial trade barriers is probably something that you've heard even if you didn't read today's Globe, and it's something that I think has just been repeated so much in Canadian political discourse that people just kind of accept that there are all of these interprovincial trade barriers without really thinking about it. But when in fact you do stop and think about it for a minute or so, it's not very clear what that means, because of course there's no customs stations along provincial borders, there's no tariffs on interprovincial trade. The Canadian Constitution very clearly puts interprovincial trade into federal jurisdiction, so Canadian courts can actually strike down any effort by the provinces to obstruct interprovincial trade if provincial governments wanted to do that. So it's not obvious that there actually are interprovincial barriers in Canada, and indeed one of the really striking things about this whole debate about TILMA and these interprovincial trade agreements is that the people who are putting them forward have a great deal of difficulty actually identifying interprovincial trade barriers. So they'll use the word interprovincial trade barriers, but they can't actually name very many specific barriers. And often what they do, instead of providing specific examples, is they say, oh, there's too many of these interprovincial barriers to count. There's so many of them out there, no one's been able to even catalog them all. But of course the obvious response is, if there's really so many, why can't they list 5 or 10 or 15 or 20? And they never can. The other thing that often happens in the debate is you get a huge amount of focus on just 1 or 2 examples of interprovincial barriers. So one thing that got kicked around for years in Canada was the color of margarine in Quebec. The fact that in Quebec you weren't allowed to sell margarine that was colored to look like butter. And this was an example that is always put forward of all these interprovincial trade barriers. Aren't they crazy? But in fact, as I think people's chuckles kind of reveal, it's a pretty trivial example. And in fact, a couple of years ago, Quebec actually got rid of that regulation, and now you can sell yellow margarine in Quebec, so everything's fine. And what that's done is it's led these people who want to sort of whip up concern about interprovincial trade barriers to look for other examples. So now one of the things mentioned in this Globe and Mail op-ed is the fact that the little containers, that you get for milk or cream in a restaurant are slightly different sizes in different provinces. This is now being put forward as like an interprovincial trade barrier that we should be concerned about and that requires kind of a dramatic federal intervention to address it. So this whole concept of interprovincial trade barriers is a bit dubious. One final thing, in the early 1980s, there was actually a royal commission set up to study this problem, the famous MacDonald Commission. And the research that they commissioned actually concluded that interprovincial barriers cost only 0.05% of gross domestic product. So that's 1/20th of 1 percentage point of the economy. And that's back when there were actually some interprovincial trade barriers. There were actually some restrictions on, having to brew beer in the same province where you sold it, and rules like that have since been done away with. And of course, the result is that the MacDonald Commission, even though it was supposed to be about the Canadian Economic Union, didn't actually really propose anything on the interprovincial trade front because there just wasn't anything to deal with. Instead, what it did is it shifted its focus to international trade and ended up recommending the Canada-US free trade agreement instead. So of course, they obviously didn't think interprovincial trade was all that worthwhile an issue.